Okay, we're good to go. Great. Welcome everyone to the Queer Publishing 101 panel. Just a quick note before we get started, we did have some issues with our closed captioning service today. We have our ASL interpreter L, and we'll be working to get the video recording of this panel caption. So apologies to anyone who needs that service today. My name is Emily Holland. I am a lesbian poet, writer, editor of America's oldest poetry magazine, Poet Lore, incoming OutWrite Chair, and today the moderator of this amazing panel. So I don't want to eat into any more of our time since an hour goes by so quickly, but thank you all for joining us today on your Sunday afternoon. And now I will pass to our panelists to do a quick introduction, who you are, what genre you work in, and any ideas that you have to get us started with this amazing panel. Maybe I'll just call on who I see first to my right, Shelly.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shelly Romero. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the lead editor at Cake Creative. We are a book packager, which means that we create, develop, and sell our IP to publishers. And our goal at Cake is to basically act as a launch pad for authors, and we have a focus on inclusive storytelling. And in terms of what I like to work on, I work on a variety of genres, but as you can see probably from my bookshelves, my wall decor, my favorite genre is horror. But I do have a soft spot for some coming of age, slice of life, rom-com.
Wonderful. Yeah, love a looming ghost face in the back.
Yes, my bestie.
Up next, Saint.
Hi, my name is Saint. I'm a Boston-based author and literary agent. I'm with Speilburg Literary, and I mainly represent adult science fiction, fantasy, and horror. I love the Gothic. I love cross-genre speculative work, and I also represent adult category romance.
Great. Another horror genre here representing. All right, let's go to Chris.
Hi everyone, I'm Chris Gonzalez. My pronouns are he, him. I'm a writer of short fiction, mainly. My collection, I'm Not Hungry But I Could Eat, came out in December. And I'm also a fiction editor at Barrelhouse magazine. And I'm mostly in the realist literary fiction genre, but of course I do enjoy some speculative and humor writing as well.
Wonderful. And last but not least, Lauren.
Hello, everyone. I'm glad to be here with you today. I am the managing editor and creative director for BLF Press, which is a Black feminist press dedicated to amplifying the work of Black women and queer women of color. I have been with BLF Press since 2019. Before that, I was an indie publisher. I primarily write about, it's very simple, Southern Black women and girls, but if I had to wrap it up very nicely into a genre, it would be Black lesbian fiction.
Awesome. Love the range of genres and types of writing and styles and publishing. This is going to be a great panel. So before the panel met, we got some questions submitted from the author C.R. Foster. And so I wanted to start with one of their questions, which is, what are the two essential things every writer needs before beginning the submission or query process? What do we need to get started? And this can be very broad, very specific. And I'll just let whoever wants to jump in first, go right ahead.
I'll jump in there because I think my response may be a little broad, but I think just from my experiences in publishing since 2010, the first thing I would say that you really need to know what you want from your work and what you want from your publisher, because that's going to direct how you direct your publishing journey. It will also direct your writing journey as well. For example, I've encountered writers just like, they want to write, they want to publish, and they automatically want to be on the, New York Times bestsellers list. It's like, okay, well, how are you going to get there? Because your journey to that list is completely different than your journey trying to query and get published by an indie publisher. They're just two different things, right? And so if you know what you want, you know that you're going to have to do certain things to get there. So know your goals, know your objectives, and know what's important to you. Another thing I would say is you really, really have to understand the lay of the land. I mean, you need to understand publishing broadly. You need to understand it generally. And just thinking about it, for example, I would just say, I recently bought a car, and I would be at a disadvantage if I didn't know anything about the car buying process. I would also be at a disadvantage if I didn't realize what has changed around the car buying process since the pandemic, because things have changed. And so I think about that the same way that the publishing industry, what has changed in the last 2 or 3 years? What do you need to do differently now that we didn't have to do a couple of years ago? And I'll be honest with you, I can't answer that question because I'm not a publisher anymore. I took off that hat. I don't wear that hat anymore. But I would imagine that there are things that you have to do differently now than say 5 or 10 years ago, because so much has changed in publishing. So yeah, those are my 2 things that I will offer.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks.
Hi, thank you so much, Lauren. That was a great answer. Coming from my perspective as someone who is working as an agent in traditional publishing, especially if that is your aim, but not just if that is your aim to go traditional, I think 2 things that are really important. The first is finding some sense of community or camaraderie, like being able to have a small group of people, whether they're people that you've met through online writing groups, or their friends or family, or they're people that you've met in IRL spaces, that you can share your work with, and that you can share in the highs and lows of this experience with, because it can be very isolating, and it can be a very individualistic process. Like the writer's life can be just something that you kind of go into your room and close the door and do. And I think if you want to have longevity and endurance as you build your career, it's really important to be supported by people who can share in your experiences, and who can celebrate with you, and who can grieve with you. And then the other thing that is really essential, if you're trying to position your book either in the indie market or getting it in front of the right agent to get it in front of the right publisher, is really reading in your genre specifically, and reading from the past 5 years, which sounds like, I think that's a very broad advice, like stay reading, but it's, I think, really easy to just focus in on the writing so much that you're not staying up to date on what your contemporaries are saying, what other voices in your genre are contributing to the stories that you want to tell, which is not to say that you should be chasing trends. I don't think that that's, in the long run, a very sustainable career choice. I think you'll get burned out really quickly, and it doesn't always translate to success. But I think you do need to know what conversations are being had by the stories that you want to contribute to.
I absolutely agree with both of y'all's, that is absolutely fantastic advice. And what I would definitely also say, I think another thing is also just to know that this is for traditional publishing, this is a very long process. This is a game of patience at times and I say this as not a patient person. So I'm like, but it takes a long time to publish a book, and it can be hard when you're seeing people getting this or that, or why have they gotten an agent and I haven't gotten an agent, I'm still querying. It can be hard to be comparing yourselves and wanting to have that. Every publishing journey is so completely different. Even for an author, every publishing of their books are completely different from the other. So a lot of it is a waiting game. I absolutely agree. Staying on top of what's been published right now. We use a lot of comparative titles. I know that's been used a lot in the querying process, comps, what has been published within the last 3-4 years that you that can be compared to your book in terms of theming, tone, genre, and things like that. I would also say, in terms of submitting to both agents, and also if you're submitting an agent to a traditional publishing house, are you ready? Is it ready? Or are you wanting it to be ready? This goes in hand with the patience thing that I see a lot of time. People are just rushing to get published. They're just rushing to get this book out. And it's a book that is absolutely not ready. It needs to be refined. It needs to go through editing before that And I would also say, because there's been a lot of unagented houses asking for unagented authors, do your research with them. Do your research with editors that reach out to you. Not every editor here is going to be a good person for you, a good advocate, a good ally to you and your writing. And you have to go digging in. Do they have other authors on their list that have your same, identities and intersectionalities? Have they properly represented those before, or have they not?
Great. Yeah, I think that research piece and that patience piece really go hand in hand as well. Chris, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think sort of going back to what Saint was talking about with like community building, it makes me think of, for those who are sort of looking to submit to literary journals and like, which run the gamut, right? So, we immediately think of like the New Yorker, the Paris Review, but like there are so many journals in between that are great at promoting their writers and like sharing work online. They might not be able to pay that much. And it's not to say that like, paying an exposure is like that great of a thing, but when you're just starting out and you're trying to find other writers in your genre who are like at your level, as someone who might be emerging, as someone who might be new to publishing, that is an exciting like world to be in. So don't sort of, like aim high, of course, but like there don't only aim high when you're starting out, and you'll be able to meet some other writers who are at your level who you can grow together with. And I think that's sort of how I met a lot of my friends in indie publishing in particular, other friends who also like share identities with me. And also agents are reading a lot of these journals. So, like down the line, you could be cultivating a readership and a community and like gaining interest in your work that you might not be able to see at the moment. And it goes back to what Shelly was also talking about with like patience, and it's about the long game, which I think everyone's touching upon, right? That like, it's not about getting it right from the jump. It's about sort of, I don't know, growing and building something.
Yeah, I love bringing in literary journals too, because sometimes you can sort of get your own community, like, oh, we're in the same issue, and then you start following what they're reading, and that kind of builds those connections out as well. I did want to turn to our first question from the audience, because I think it's connected to what we're talking about. A question from Stephen. Stephen saying, I'm interested to hear about the crossover between queer publishing and publishing generally. I've seen perceptions that they're extremely balkanized. How separate are they from your perspective, or are they not separate?
I mean, I think I would say in terms of the traditional publishing sphere, there is still a whole lot of work to be done in terms of that representation. And I think even going further of saying like, we have gotten a lot of really wonderful queer rep, but a lot of the times the editors and publishers who are buying that queer rep are buying queer white rep. And there's not a lot of that intersectionality of having BIPOC authors who are queer and their stories being told. We definitely have some. We definitely will never have enough, in my opinion. And it's a matter of having people who are, like I mentioned, who are editors who are going to be asking for those submissions from agents, advocating for them in-house, going into the acquisitions meeting and saying, this is the book that I want to publish, like this is the book, right? And championing those authors and taking care of those authors. Because even if, you might be from the same identities, like it might also not be good for you. So it's just a matter of the fact that like, it is still hard to go into acquisition meetings and say like, this is what we need. And while there is, if you see like the Lee and Low diversity baseline surveys, like it is overwhelmingly white. It is also overwhelmingly white and queer at times. And that's the stories that you're getting. But there are people doing that push. There are people like myself. I mean, I'm adjacent now to traditional publishing who are fighting for these books and trying to get these books published. But we just sometimes don't have that support. And that's a lot of the problem.
Yeah, I agree with you. From where I sit, there's I don't see a lot of crossover. There's a lot of division. And even in recent years, when we kind of saw a lot of publishers trying to respond to like social justice movement and saying that they would devote more resources to, for example, Black queer writers, I still don't see it. Now, part of that, as we've already acknowledged here, it takes a long time, right? From the time you could get an agent or acquisitions to the time you see that book on the shelf, it takes time, right? But at some point, I would still want to see the fruits of those quote unquote promises. From where I sit, when it comes to Black women, Black queer women writers, we don't do traditional. Those doors have not really been open to us. If you're going to be published, if you're going to get your work out there, for the most part, you're going to do self-publishing, or you're going to go the indie press route, because those are your only options. In 2016, I founded the Black Lesbian Literary Collective, and one thing we say there, as well as within our press, BLF Press, go where you are loved. Go where you are loved. And so we have to go where people aren't going to shut doors just because we're bringing our identities into our work. And that means that we have very few doors open for us. So I definitely agree with Shelly said, that if we do see crossover, it's very specific types of writing, sometimes coming from very specific writers.
I love that statement. Go where you're loved, and also, go where you're supported. I think both of you touched too on, we need to put some money behind these books. We need to put some money behind the marketing, behind the authors, how to support them, not just, okay, we published the book, but how do we continue to support careers and longevity? Saint or Chris, did you want to jump in?
I just want to echo what's already been said. And I think as well, you mentioned, Emily, money. And I think that like a lot of times publishing will actually display its level of investment, both emotional and monetarily, into something with the kinds of advances that are being given and the kind of advanced payout structures that we're seeing. And I think that there's still a lot of work to be done to ensure that queer authors, and especially queer authors of color and disabled queer authors and authors that are at the intersectionality of a lot of different identities, who want to bring their whole self to the table and be celebrated for their work. We have a lot of work to do to make sure that people are getting paid, not just adequately, but generously, and with this sense of like true investment into these stories. Something that also came to mind that's kind of a sidebar that I think is interesting is, I do think Lauren was discussing how you see sometimes more diverse stories in indie or with small presses. And I think previously, maybe this is just my perception, but there was a further divide between the conversations that were happening in traditional small press and indie. And now I think we're kind of having indie has never been as accessible as it is now. There's a lot of amazing voices rising up in indie and doing phenomenal things, and there always have been, but I think there's more eyes on them now. And, Book Talk and Instagram and social media still definitely skews, white and cis hetero, and has its biases. But I do think that there's a little bit more wiggle room for authors to find their readers and to market themselves with the kinds of conversations that are happening on social right now. So that does give me some hope, because I'm seeing more like queer books and more indie books in bookstores than I ever have before. But there's still a ton of work to be done, especially when it comes to who's actually getting paid.
Yeah, I actually sort of, Lauren and Saint both talked about like indie and as having gone through the like indie book publishing process myself fairly recently, and I guess still going through it technically. And it's interesting. I feel like I think indie is where the exciting work is, where the sort of like radical queer work is happening, because, traditional mainstream publishing is very, I don't know, as a writer and a reader, it's like, on the one hand, you want authors, especially like queer authors, to get the big advances, but sort of what happens when like a mainstream industry backs a book and you know, I just feel like there is a there can be a like, what is the word, like a sanitization, I don't know, that's the word, that can happen, not always, but with certain books that get pushed into the mainstream. But it's interesting. I mean, something I'm thinking about when I was going through the process was like this need to come up with comp titles. And if you are one of a few, who are your comp titles? And so, you know, I think hopefully in a few years, we do see a lot of the fruits of like the past couple of years of these calls, as Lauren was talking about. But it's sort of like if traditional publishing is still operating on this model of like using previous success to decide monetary value on an upcoming title, but how do you determine previous success for something that is only just recently welcomed? And I don't want to go on in a rant about comp titles, but I think for me as a queer author of color coming through, it was a very disheartening experience to sort of, who are these books? Like, you know, We the Animals was great, but it came out in 2012. Like I can't use that as a comp title. And I shouldn't have to sort of like, I don't know, rummage through and the last 2 to 3 years to try to figure out who I can use instead of, I don't know, looking at a book beyond just sort of like how you can market it in the way that other books have been marketed. I don't know, but that's something that was like a frustration. And I think it's important to highlight those frustrations that can come up as like queer authors or for queer authors.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Thank you all for those responses. To move on to some more questions, do y'all have any guidance or wisdom to share with queer writers who might be concerned about discrimination or stigma around their stories as they're approaching the publishing industry? I mean, we're at a time where book banning is happening. There's a lot of conversation about maybe, Chris, that sort of sanitization of our stories as they get into different hands. So I'm just wondering if you have any advice, tips, places where queer writers can turn to for good resources into different publishers.
I can't think of resources right now, but I would say like when you are to that stage in your querying process and you've gotten your agent and then you're out on submission and you've maybe got an editor or maybe an editor or two who are looking to potentially acquire your title, and you do get to have that agent call, maybe say, and you can also, I'm not sure what all the questions, because I've only done it from the other end, but asking those questions to that editor of like, you know, what is your vision for this book? Like, what are the things that you think I'm needing improvement upon? Like, what are the strengths here? And like really digging in to see what that editor's editorial vision for that is and how they're going to be championing it and how they're going to be positioning it. Colleagues, to sales, to marketing, publicity. But then also, you know, we're also thinking about how we're going to position it based off like the cover copy that we're writing, right? Or the copy that we're writing that's going to be distributed out into the retailers, like, you know, on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and whatnot. So asking those questions, I think, is going to maybe give you a good indicator of what they're seeing for your book. In general, what I always tell authors is that my edits, my advice to you, my things that I'm wanting you to tweak are mostly suggestions. I'd love for you to make them, but at the end of the day, you're the one who gets to tell me step. And you're the one whose name goes on that book. My name is not on that front cover. My name is maybe in the acknowledgements, sometimes in the copyright page, right? But it is your book, and you're wanting to have someone that meshes with your own vision of it and how you want it to be put out into the world. You know, I think in terms of what we were just talking about with like the sanitation, I think a lot of the times too, publishing has certain ideas of what it means to, you know, be queer and to what our identities mean and like how that person should act and things like that. so it's definitely hard to push up against those perceptions and push up against those people who are absolutely not of our identities, who are cis, straight, white, and are in their 50s and have never had another job or fell into these roles, right? But you know, we're trying.
To piggyback off what Shelly was saying, if you're going the traditional route, your agent is your first line of defense. Your agent should be your biggest advocate. They should be always positioning themselves towards encouraging you to make your most, do your best work, but in the most authentic way and in the way that is most aligned with your personal vision and your personal goals and needs. So I think Shelly had great tips for how to, from the agent's perspective, how to talk to the editor. And I think really digging into the editorial vision before you sign that contract is really important to say, but what, like, how are you planning on positioning this book in the market? What edits do you want to be made? Who do you think the audience for this book is? And if that's clashing with where the author is coming from, that's an issue. Like, that's something that needs to be ironed out beforehand, or maybe that's not actually the right home for the book. But I think when you're at the agent stage and you're on that call with the agent, asking the agent not only, you know, what kinds of authors and stories do you represent? Do you represent someone that is from a similar background or identity to me? Are you excited about these stories? Are you reading these kinds of stories? It's okay to dig into that. And it's as a queer author, I think really important to know that the agent is invested in you for the long term and you as an author, and not just in this one-off story that they think they can sell. Like, that's great. You want the agent to be excited about your book and have a vision for who they can sell it to and where it can be in the market. But you really want to feel like they are completely invested in you as a person. And that should include your queerness or your disability or your racial background. Like, it can't just be, I only have a vision for this one book. So I think really getting into there with the agent is important.
I think I'll add something really quick, and that I think a lot of people don't know about when they're coming into publishing, is that, especially when you're starting that negotiation, you've gotten an offer, your agent is representing you and the editor is representing the house in that moment. So just like a little inside baseball there, which, you know.
Something for those who are maybe like close to they have a book coming out. I could be wrong. I feel like Alex Chi had a Twitter thread about sort of like, you know, the interviewing and like the promotion of the book and coming up with a way of thinking about like potential questions that you might come up against and answers you could have to them. And I think this is also a useful time to think about sort of what lines you don't want to cross when you're discussing your book. Like, how much of you do you not want to sort of reveal or feel like you have to like exploit just to like promote your book? Because I do think with any sort of marginalized writer, there is this pressure to like, you know, divulge like trauma and like, or also just focus on the identities and not the actual craft of the book. And I know other writers who have talked about sort of certain framing and like just coming up with a defense against those sorts of questions that might toe that line, and how you can reframe them and bring them back to the book. It's something I didn't do and I wish I had done, but I think that's sort of like anticipating potential, which like is unfortunate, but it is possible. And that's only, you know, you can discuss it with your agent, you can talk about it with other writer friends. But I think just going into the like promotional sphere a little prepared is always a good thing.
Lauren, did you want to add anything? I could feel some of this kind of circling back to your first point about knowing, you know, what your vision is for your work and how to carry that through this whole process. So anything that you wanted to jump in and add?
I really don't. I think you all really hit a lot of great points. I was just, you know, ditto, finding a home, you know, find somewhere that's going to love your work as much as you do and not try to mold you or your story into being something that it was never meant to be, right? The goal is to make it better, not to make it different. And so I agree with you, Shelly. Like, even when I'm wearing my editing hat, like, I'm here to help you consider things that you may have missed or to make things better. that you never considered. But even within this whole idea of stigma, I would hope this isn't the case in 2022, because I know I've kind of seen it presented in different ways, this whole idea of universality. Like, is it a universal story? Like, why wouldn't it be just because it's queer, right? So I have to prove to you that this would be something that every audience could relate to. And if you are if you do meet those type of barriers, I'll just say, run away quickly. So yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to jump to a question in the chat that feels connected to what Chris was talking about, that sort of promotion aspect. What are the best ways for an indie press author, maybe any author, to promote their queer books? I know we've talked a little bit about social media, interviewing, so general thoughts on that.
Well, I would say if you're an indie press author, you're going to have to be really creative, right? Because unlike, if you are publishing through traditional press that may have way more resources than your indie press, then you may find that you don't have to do certain things that an indie author will have to do. Especially if the publisher could provide certain levels of marketing or any type of dollars to help you get your work out there. But a lot of times you aren't going to find that in indie presses. They just don't have the budget for it. And that's the truth. So you're going to be, it's going to be really important for you to work with the publisher to determine how they can support you in getting your work out there for, say, the first 12 months. And that's something that could be part of your contract. Have a conversation about it. What type of support can you give me for the first year after my book is released to help get it out there? You need to know, are they going to help you with a book, a book tour? Are they going to help you find different conferences you can attend? Or, can they pay for you to be a vendor at local events? All those type of things is very important when you're indie press. When you're an indie author. But if you're going to be independent, you just know that you're going to be in charge of a lot of your promotion.
I think also this is where it can feel like this very lonely process, and the burden, especially as Lauren was saying, on an indie author is usually on themselves. But this is where that network comes into, if you've been doing it for a while, if you cultivated a network, you should find that people are excited to help you. And of course, you should also be helping them. And, I'm thinking of, there's an author, Alejandro Varela, who's the author of The Town of Babylon. His book came out in March, but he's been sort of partnering with other queer authors at his readings and inviting them in. And I mean, he was able to travel a little, right? But you might not be able to if you can only do a very local tour, or an East Coast tour or virtual, whatever it is. I think just doing it with your friends will make it better, and they'll bring in people who only know their work. You'll have people who might only know your work. But I think that community is going to be the most helpful thing. And reimagining spaces, right? It doesn't always have to be bookstores. It could be community spaces. It could be your local, queer outreach facilities in your local area. I think you can get creative in that way, and just, think about the world and how you can tap into it. But it does require a lot of work, and it's also okay if you can't do it all. I think you'll never think you're doing enough. But I think, as a writer who also has a day job, I can only do so much. And so just think about, maybe 5 things you would like to accomplish. And if you do more than that, that's great. And if you go under, maybe that's also okay. But I just be realistic with what you can actually accomplish with your own resources and own time.
To touch a little bit on the relationship of the indie author to social media in particular, I tell this to my clients, and I've had this conversation with my friends who are hybrid or who are totally indie. there is this pressure, I think, like Chris was saying, to do it all, because as Lauren pointed out, if you are going the indie route, you are taking on a higher level of marketing responsibility. Like that's part of the trade-off that you make when you're choosing which avenue you want to go, indie, traditional, or hybrid. But there's a huge, I think, feeling that you have to be up to date on every social media platform and on every micro trend, and being on Book Talk and Bookstagram and having hot takes on Twitter, and also keeping up a website and do a newsletter. And I always tell people that I care about, choose 1 to 2 that you can do sustainably and that you have like the best emotional relationship to. If you're not a person who's very comfortable putting themselves out there, it might not always feel natural, but there are some platforms that are more activating to the nervous system for certain people than others. There are some platforms that just aren't intuitive to other people. If you're really good with text, Twitter might be better for you. If you like doing flat lays and photography composition is engaging to your creativity, Instagram might be better for you. So just choose 1 to 2 and always have a website, always have a place where you can gather emails for newsletters through your website. Even if you don't want to do newsletters, you don't have anything to say yet, you're going to want those emails. Always have those 2 things. But as far as social goes, picking 1 to 2 that you can do, even if it's just starting out doing updates only and then building up from there, is I think the way to go, as opposed to scattershot trying to do 5 different platforms. You will get burned out and you won't see yourself getting a lot of traction or connecting with the right readers if you take that avenue.
I will add, in terms of website, please put on like an email or contact form, because as someone who used to work and still does planning conferences and festivals, if we can't reach you, we can't invite you to things. And that also does hurt authors.
Great, thank you. Yeah, those are all great tips. And I love Saint, that sort of reframing of the marketing via social media as something that's also creatively nurturing for the writer. I think that sometimes can get lost, like, I have to do all these things. But if you know you like taking photos, then maybe Instagram's for you. And I haven't ever thought of it that way. So thank you for that. And thank you all for all of those tips. I wanted to ask kind of a general question just about submitting and receiving rejections, receiving acceptances, just that whole process of submission. So I know that maybe we are all on different sides of the submission, receiving, rejecting sort of workflow, but if you all could just talk about what advice you have for people who are maybe in the middle of that submission process, query process, and what it means maybe to receive a tiered rejection or a warm rejection, and the different types of levels of engagement on that side of things.
As someone on the side of reviewing submissions, I know for an author, it's always nice when they don't just get, a generic rejection letter. If you have an editor who would take a little time to maybe provide a reason for the rejection, but that's not always going to happen. So I don't think you can automatically assume that if your work was rejected, that something was wrong with you. Something was wrong with your submission. That's not always the case. I just know there have been times on our end where we reject because we don't have the capacity for anything more. Or we reject because, I don't always like this word, it didn't fit, right? But once you get submissions and you review those submissions, sometimes things emerge. And sometimes what you submitted, it just didn't fit, right? If everything is over here and yours was kind of the outlier, it didn't mean that anything was wrong. We just can't make it fit within the publication. I don't see anything wrong with asking why I was rejected. If it was important enough for you to write and submit it and want to be part of that publication. And I'm thinking more on the end of like literary journals, because it's something we do as well. Then I think it's okay to ask, because if there is something that that editor could say to you that will help you avoid in the future, then that's something you definitely want to know.
I would just add, since Lauren's talking about literary journals, that to the feedback question, and especially for rejections, that like sometimes the editor, sometimes not all feedback is helpful. Sometimes if the editor just completely didn't get your story, anything they could offer you might not actually be helpful. And I think if you're a writer who's like long enough in the process, who has been doing this, not to internalize all feedback. But if you're early on, you might be like, oh, okay, if I just do this and I fix this story, maybe you don't know your voice well enough, maybe you don't have your vision well enough. So I think it's helpful in terms of like what that specific editor might be looking for if they are kind enough to like offer more thorough feedback. But I guess just like also be wary of potential feedback, because not all feedback can be useful, and that sometimes it's just a simple no. It might actually be the most productive response for you. And then also as a fiction editor, I think sometimes we do encourage, if you get a higher tiered rejection, encouraging you to resubmit. It doesn't mean do it right away, but it means like if you do have something, if you've taken your time with something, do send it to us. And if we see your name enough time in the queue, if we read your work, we might start understanding your work a little more, might grow gravitating towards it. And we might get to a point where like maybe you receive a solicitation because we become a fan of your work, or we just like, oh, like this is like the fourth story this person has submitted. Like it's really vibing with me now in a way that like 4 stories ago it didn't. Because it's all subjective. It's all people like making these decisions. So yes, if you are like told to resubmit, do so. If you're told to revise and resubmit, like don't rush it. Definitely take time with it, and it's okay. It's also okay to go elsewhere. You are allowed to do that. Yeah, I think those are my thoughts on submitting to literary journals.
Yeah, that patience really comes in, especially in those moments where you get invited to resubmit and you maybe want to take a step back and really evaluate your own work before doing so. Shelly or Saint, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, so the way I now do submissions is completely different from the way I used to do, but I will say in terms of advice to, when you're agented and submitting to a traditional publishing house, again, with the patients, they're like the editor response times are double or even triple as long. Like it is pretty wild, but that is the effect of an industry that doesn't want to pay editors, that doesn't want to hire more editors and alleviate ridiculous, boring admin work that editors should not be doing, and then only focusing on their editorial. But yeah, there is a lot of times where that like phrase of like, oh, no answer is not a bad answer, it's maybe a good answer. I've held on to submissions for months and months because I was like, I really think that this might be it, but I'm so overwhelmed right now. I'm so tired, and I'm really trying to get through my submissions that I know I immediately don't like. And I really want to take the care of reviewing the submission and making sure, okay, like what is my gut telling me? Because we can't publish everything. We can't publish everything that we love. We can't publish, we can't go to acquisitions every week. Going to acquisitions would take a week or and a half, or if it was an auction, more than that out of my like whole work time. And I was still assisting back then. So it's definitely that waiting game. If you haven't heard back, that editor just might not be getting to it. Things slow down a lot. I feel like they're about to slow down in around the August time, where everyone's just doing their summer vacation, and then it'll slow down again between that stretch from like Thanksgiving to the holidays in December, because people are going to be leaving, they're going to be going away. So that is also just like another thing to remember. There are those lulls. When you're submitting to a book packager like Cake, again, like sometimes no response is a good response. Sometimes we may have writers that we've had submit through our submittable that we just don't have a project for yet, that we're just kind of waiting and marinating to see, okay, what project might be best for them. Maybe we come up with one. So it's just all of that, like, taking that time, taking a breather. Maybe talking to your friends who have gone through similar processes. Like that's the refrain we've been all saying, like community, and just playing that waiting game.
When I first started agenting, I asked around to some agents that I was friendly with or that I admired their work. And I said, you know, can I buy you a coffee and can we have a Zoom? And can I just pick your brain about your experience? And I remember talking to this one agent and I asked him, what's the hardest part about the job? And he said, oh, giving out rejections. And at the time I was like, I can do that. And now that I am agenting, that is, I think, one of the hardest parts. I think the patience and not seeing things you really love and have faith in find a home is really difficult. But it is hard to pass on things that just aren't quite right or that have so much going for them, or that you know that you don't have the right editorial vision for it. And kind of bouncing off what Chris was saying, it is, I think that you should hold on to a certain degree if you get personalized feedback from an agent, if you're trying to go the traditional route, because it means that the agent did take the time to read and it was important enough to them that they wanted to share this, but it isn't always the most helpful thing. So really sticking to your vision and what you want out of the project and what you're trying to say, especially if it seems like it's in conflict with what one agent's opinion was. But also as an agent, we have a lot of conversations with ourselves about, is my feedback going to be useful? There's a lot of frustration that authors feel, and I've been in the query trenches and I totally understand, where you're just getting form rejections and the agent had it for 6 months and then they form rejected you. What's that about? But a lot of times we know that we don't want to get into the author's head and give them feedback about how, oh, this voice just wasn't the right fit for me, because that's so vague and doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your voice. And we don't want to discourage someone from continuing in this vein of following their artistic vision. So it can be very fraught deciding whether or not to send feedback, even if you have the wherewithal and the bandwidth to do that, which we don't always have. So that's just a little bit of backstage into what's going on through an agent's head when they're sending a form rejection or like a tiered rejection. Like I have, I have form rejections that are just this, not a right fit, keep going, love to see it for you. And then I have form rejections that are like, I really liked this and please submit again if you feel like we could be a good fit. And so I think holding on to that, if it is useful to you, can be a helpful way to get yourself through the trenches.
Great. While we're talking about agents, there's a question from Kimberly. Do poets and or short story writers need an agent, or is working with editors a better fit? So question for the group, and I can jump in for the poetry side at some point if we get there.
So as a short story writer who sold his first book, I sort of sold my book to the publisher without an agent, and then got signed with an agent after the fact. Especially with indie, it's like you don't quote unquote need an agent sometimes. However, you're dealing with contracts, you're dealing with rights, you're dealing with things that sort of like are maybe above your like day-to-day knowledge. So if you're doing it without an agent, I would say that look into other ways of like having someone. I mean, like I was fortunate, I did have a friend who like studied law. So I was like, can you look over this contract for me? There's also, I believe, the Authors Guild, which is like, will like review contracts for you. It does, I think, cost, there's like a membership fee or something, but that is an option just so that you're protected and making sure that like you're not signing away all of your rights. And I think that's my big advice. I mean, like indie, you don't need an agent, but like an agent is your advocate, and an agent, can help you have those difficult conversations and also just make sure you're protected. So, but, it also depends on the type of career you want. And like, I think, Shelly and Saint can speak to this, but like traditional publishing, though they have been putting out more like unagented submission requests, whatever, it's still the case that like many of them won't review manuscripts that are like unagented. So it really depends on the sphere you're trying to navigate and and the career that you want to have long term.
I think it's also good to point out that there's less agents that represent poetry and short story collections, and it would have to be a collection, not just an individual short story, even if you're really proud of it. You would submit directly if that was the case. Then there are agents that represent long form fiction, and there's a lot of different reasons for that. But a lot of times, not always, I do know authors who have been signed on collections, especially if they had some publications previously, or the collection had a really strong theme or was really timely, and they found an agent that was comfortable working with collections or anthologies and new editors that were interested in that. It's just a specialized skill that not every agent has. But I think a good strategy, if you are interested in doing a lot of different kinds of formats, could be handling poetry submissions, individual short story submissions yourself, and then trying to use that to springboard into querying with a full-length manuscript, because that's kind of your best way to introduce yourself and your work to an agent, is with a full-length novel, sometimes a novella, but not very often. So that is kind of a strategy that I've seen some authors take, and very similar to what Chris said, a lot of times agents will reach out if you have a short story that they read and loved, or that was nominated for something, or that they just happened to stumble across and was interested in seeing if you're interested in doing long form work. But I also want to echo what Chris said, that you'd want to have someone in your corner helping you out. If you're managing, especially if you're managing your own subrights, that can get very complicated, and you want to hold on to your subrights as much as you can, and you want to sell those if you can. So just I always say with indie, it feels like you're doing everything yourself, but you're actually like assembling your own little team. You're assembling an editorial team, you're assembling a community, you're assembling people who you can talk to when you have contracts and things like that. So that's just a little bit of insight into one avenue that you can take.
Yeah, I think I mentioned this briefly about like seeing all these calls for, I think it was like Black unagented authors, please submit. We're opening only for you. BIPOC creators, we're typically agented only, but we're opening up this one imprint for you to submit to. I saw a lot of those calls, especially in June 2020, that lovely summer. And working in-house, I was like, I don't trust that. I don't trust that for a variety of reasons. First of all, these teams were all white and did not really have a lot of BIPOC creators on their list in the first place. But it felt a little predatory. It felt a little predatory to be doing this in the summer of 2020, and then to be also saying, oh, be unagented. For me, again, I said the editor represents the house in the negotiations. If you get an offer, be like, oh my God, yeah, thank you so much. Let me see if I can have someone review this. Let me see if I can get an agent. Like, let me see if I can have that someone, as Chris and Sid were saying, in my corner. Because there is a lot of contracts, and even for me, someone who worked and was doing this, there's a lot in that contract that can be very tricky, very complicated, very legalese, that you might not have the wherewithal to like figure out. So just be very wary.
Lauren, did you want to jump in and add anything?
No, I won't say anything, because I know we're running out of time, probably have more questions.
Yeah, we are unfortunately, sadly, almost out of time. So I wanted to turn it back to each of you. And if you could just point to something that excites you about queer publishing today, as we wrap up, and maybe just give a quick shout out to where people can find you online, if you're open for submissions, things like that.
I would say one thing that excites me about queer publishing today, and this is really, I'd say in the last 5 or 10 years, specifically with print on demand, is just a growth among indie presses. Because I just feel like without those indie presses, we wouldn't see a lot of queer work. Without the indie presses, we wouldn't see a lot of short stories. And I saw that someone in the chat had mentioned something about novellas. I think that indie press may be a good route if you have a novella. And so there's a little more flexibility. There's more opportunity to find a home for who you are and what you're putting out there. So indie presses really excite me, and even the collaboration among indie presses is something that really excites me, and I hope to see more of.
I always take an opportunity to do some promoing. So for me, one of my favorite poetry collections of all time, that I read this in 3 hours and then started sobbing immediately, because that's what representation does to you when you finally see it, is Catrachos by Roy G. Guzman. As someone who is both from Miami, who is first generation Honduran, to read this, to find about this collection and read it was just really life-changing, to see that representation finally, like 26 years like into my life, right, was absolutely amazing. So, and also supporting smaller presses. This is from Grey Wolf Press. But I would say shout out to 2 of my books, Join the Club, Maggie Diaz, and this is a middle grade, has some queer rev, and then The Witchery, which is a YA, very messy, fun queer rev. And then I think you could find me on Twitter at _SM Romero.
I don't know. I think just like with queer publishing, more and more like queer authors of color on the scene is where like my excitement lies. And I'm always, when I come across a story in a journal, especially like at the literary journal level, I think that's where I'm most excited to see like the careers that are going to like blossom at some point, if like we cultivate and sort of like support them now. So, you know, it's exciting that like, I think we do have more and more stories that are getting these like big book deals, right? But for me, I'm like, you know, sort of like what Lauren was talking about with the indie scene, like zines and journals and like small press for me, seeing who those authors are and who they will become. And otherwise, if you're to find me, I'm on Twitter at Lives in Pages, and my book is I'm Not Hungry But I Could Eat, if you're looking for a short story collection about queer, fat Latinos.
I think the thing that I'm most excited about in queer publishing right now is actually the kinds of stories that we're seeing breaking through and finding their audience that are coming from independent publishing. Very much like what Lauren was saying with small presses, and then even people who are their own indie publisher. And I love romance. I firmly believe in the radical power of the HEA, especially when it comes to seeing yourself represented as someone desirable and who can have an adventure and who can fall in love and find a happy ending. And romance we're seeing more diversity in romance, and we're seeing traditional publishers kind of take note and be like, oh, this does sell. Like, people are buying this and they love this and it's meaningful to them. And I really hope that that trend continues, and that we get even more diverse love stories in traditional romance. But they're really finding their audience in indie right now, and it's cool to see it from such a democratic kind of approach. And you can find me on Twitter at S_T_Gibson.
Thank you. Thank you all so much for your time. Unfortunately, that is our hour. It always goes by so quickly. And I know we had some last minute questions come in, so maybe we'll continue this online somewhere and be able to keep talking. But thank you, Shelly, Lauren, Chris, and Saint, for your time today. And thank you to our wonderful audience for your questions and spending an hour with us. I'm really thankful to have gotten to be part of this discussion.
Thank you.
And upcoming in the first weekend in August is the rest of the OutWrite Festival. It's virtual this year, so please check it out. OutWrite DC. We have a great lineup of more panels, more readings, just all kinds of stuff, workshops. So please, 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 this was just like a teaser event to get us ready for August. So thank you all for being with us, and we hope to see you the first weekend in August as well.